All right. Hi and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining the call. For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Diane Dubois and I'm an organizer at the Center for Biological Diversity and I'm based in Asheville, North Carolina. I am on the call tonight with several of my colleagues here at the center. So let's go around and do some introductions. I'll start off with you, Quentin.
Hey everybody, my name is Quentin Mecke and I am the National Organizing Director here at the Center for Biological Diversity. Super excited to be on this call tonight for a really important issue and yeah, thanks for joining.
Hi everyone, my name is Tanya Sanareb and I'm the International Legal Director. I work on wildlife trade and I've come to know a lot about wildlife diseases and I'm excited to talk to you guys tonight.
And hey everyone, I'm Brett Hartle. I'm the Government Affairs Director at the Center. I split my time between Arizona and DC. I'm mostly in Arizona these days during the pandemic, and I also work on wildlife trade issues as they relate to DC national policy stuff.
Thanks to all of you for being on the call. So we've got about 400 people on the call already and many more ticking in. So I'm so glad that you're all here tonight to talk about the very timely topic of wildlife trade and how together we're actually going to end wildlife trade, stop the extinction crisis, and prevent future pandemics all at the same time. Now, that may sound ambitious, and it should. As many of you know by now from working with us, this is how we do things. So we're calling on Congress to take actions that not only match the scale of the crisis we're currently in, but also the threat of what's to come if we don't. So I'll pass it over to Quentin now to talk about what we're gonna do tonight.
Great, thanks Diane. So tonight we're going to zoom out, maybe there's a pun intended in there, and talk about wildlife trade, its role in the global extinction crisis, and the threat it poses to our health and safety. Then specifically, we're going to talk about our action plan to end wildlife trade. With that, most importantly, we're going to talk about where you come in, because the plan requires people-powered momentum and widespread public support. And of course, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send your questions in to us.
Thanks, Quentin. All right, so with that, let's jump in and let's get started with the basics. Tanya, what are we referring to when we talk about the wildlife trade?
Yeah, so the wildlife trade globally is a $3 billion a year industry. And while it usually invokes images of elephant ivory, rhino horn, it's a lot more than that, right? It's decor, for example, elephant bone or giraffe bone carvings. It's fashion. Maybe the trim on your jacket came from an animal in a faraway country. It also includes pets, lots of ornamental fish and exotic reptiles, everything from medicine, pangolin scales, and food, exotic meats, both for people and for our pets. Wildlife trade is big business around the world, and it does not include certain things though. When we talk about wildlife trade, I want to be really clear. We're not talking about local subsistence practices. We're not talking about indigenous people's customs and practices. We're talking about companies that capitalize on wildlife and your desire or someone's desire to have a primate skull in their office for decoration. These companies also profit off of people, and we have to acknowledge the need to shift local communities, indigenous people who are dependent on wildlife trade. They're part of that trade cycle for their livelihoods.
Thanks, Tanya. So people tend to think that wildlife trade is elsewhere, but the US is actually a major contributor. And so this isn't just about, or even mostly about, other countries. Brett, what is the United States' role in wildlife trade?
Yeah, so the United States, as this slide shows, we are actually a major driver of demand. We really help actually maintain a lot of these practices because we consume so much. So, you know, we're only 4 or 5% of the world population, but we're bringing in about 20%, and we're driving 20% of the global wildlife trade. And as the slide shows, you know, that's 225 million individual animals brought in alive, as well as dead parts of another 800 million individual animals. And that's a huge amount. And, it's important if you think about in the context also of pandemics, we almost inspect none of it. There's some basic reporting, but all of this is just coming into the United States. A little bit's going out as well. None of it is getting checked for potential for spreading disease.
Thanks, Brett. So yeah, here in the US, we are clearly disproportionately contributing to this issue. Tanya, how is this connected to the global extinction crisis, and what are some of the species at risk from this right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we think of the extinction crisis, a lot of people think about habitat loss, but it turns out that exploitation of wildlife, which includes trade, is the primary driver for marine species going extinct, and it's the secondary driver for terrestrial and freshwater species. So it has a really huge impact, and I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of that, especially with the current pandemic. And yeah, as you asked about, there are a lot of species that are at risk from exploitation. Again, we tend to think of the elephants and the tigers, right? But I think a lot of us, if we didn't know what a pangolin was before 2020, we know what it is now. And it's the most heavily trafficked mammal in the world. But there's also amazing, but perhaps even lesser known species like sea cucumbers, loads of ornamental fish, reptiles, amphibians that are all part of the pet trade. And again, we also have species like one of my favorites, the vaquita, which is a marine mammal that's being driven to extinction, not because it's being exploited, but because another fish in the water is, and they get caught as bycatch. So we have a lot of animals around the world that are threatened by wildlife trade.
Thanks, Tanya. So taking wild animals for profit, it's not just causing population declines here and there, it's actually a major driver of extinction. So now, in addition to impacting wildlife and wild places, we're all becoming increasingly aware of the direct consequences wildlife trade has for humans. Can you share more about how this relates to our health?
Yeah, definitely. And that takes us to the topic of zoonosis, right? So these are diseases that naturally exist in animals, and they can mutate, they can spill over and infect people. And worldwide, zoonotic diseases account for 2.7 million human deaths every year. That's a large number. Of interest, though, in particular, is the fact that over the past 40 years, most emerging diseases, and this is everything from HIV, SARS, Ebola, Zika, and now likely COVID-19, they're all zoonotic diseases. They're all transmitted from wildlife or animals to people. And really, you can sort of see from this diagram on the screen, it's our unhealthy relationship with wildlife and with nature. As we go into new habitats, we encounter new species, we put species together that haven't interacted before, we're fueling these new diseases emerging and affecting people.
Definitely. So now we know wildlife trade is a major threat to the critters we love, the wild places, and also our health. So Brett, can you tell us about our plan to end it? What are we going to do about this?
Sure. So it's a couple months ago now, we released a plan along with our friends at the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, to basically an action plan to stop future pandemics. Focusing on the United States, calling on Congress to take action in sort of three really key areas. One, we need to strengthen our foundational conservation laws to really address the threats of zoonotic disease and these types of events, as well as all of the sort of bad aspects of trade. Two, we obviously need to spend a lot more money. Congress needs to invest in this issue so that we can actually address this massive trade. And then third, to try to reestablish the role that the United States used to have as being a global leader in conservation. We were one of the first countries that ever had an Endangered Species Act. It's the model for around the world. We led the efforts in the early days to address international trade and wildlife, and we've really kind of slipped away from that leadership role. So those are kind of the pillars. And I'll just say that, you know, these are obviously big goals and will take time to reach. I can't release all the details quite yet, but I just want to let everyone know that we do think that we're going to see some really good, strong legislation shortly, hopefully within a few weeks, that we can really rally around that would really actually make a difference. And we've been working quietly on it and behind the scenes, and I can't share that much more, other than to say that we feel pretty optimistic that we're going to take some really strong steps in the right direction very soon.
I'm sure you can tell now that Brett has sort of talked about the top secret information that we're sort of alluding to, that where it's on the tip of our tongues and we're just going to have to wait a little longer, but it is very exciting. And as I'm sure you can tell from you know, Brett's presentation and the information that Tanya's talking about, that this plan isn't something that just, you know, Brett and Tanya, myself and Diane can handle on our own. This call is the beginning, what we hope is going to be a long-term campaign to really ending wildlife trade once and for all, and really, you know, bringing this country back, as Brett really just talked about, to a leadership role about protecting, you know, future generations from pandemics. As part of that, we're going to be using a multi-pronged approach, and we will be using every tactic in our toolkit to make it a success. And frankly, the key part of this, and to make this issue winnable, is you. We need to generate massive grassroots support right now to make sure that Congress and our leaders understand the importance of this issue, and that's going to mean you.
Yeah, I completely agree. The current pandemic is tragic and it's awful, but it's a symptom of the larger extinction emergency. And you guys, we need a whole team of emergency responders if we're going to stem the tide of extinctions that's coming towards species. Action needs to start here. It needs to start at home in the US. And we need to call on Congress to make big changes, including making the US a global leader again, like Brett said. We're doing everything we can to avoid future pandemics. That's why this moment is so important. Our health depends on it, but so does the health of wildlife and nature. The current situation has illustrated just how interconnected everything is with the fate of the planet. And that's why we need to seize this moment to bring about transformative change.
Absolutely. So let's take a look specifically at where all of you come in. And let's start with where we've been, because it's important to remember these issues that we work on are so interconnected. And so in some ways, many of you have already gotten a head start on this. Brett mentioned strengthening conservation laws to end wildlife trade. And several hundreds of you have worked on that earlier this year by trying to get the PAW and FIN Act passed to restore the Endangered Species Act. So together we got 127 co-sponsors on the bill and then sent 1,300 tweets to Speaker Pelosi, sending a clear message that we want the PAW and FIN Act to come to a vote. So now continuing with that, here's where we're heading. It's time to call on Congress, as Quentin and Brett have said, to stop the extinction crisis and prevent future pandemics at the same time by ending wildlife trade. Specifically, we want Congress to pass legislation to prohibit the import and export of live wildlife and shut down all live wildlife markets in the US. So Quentin, how are we going to make this happen?
Thanks, Diane. If you look at your screen now, you're going to see a plan for the next few months. First things first, our goal is to get 100,000 signatures on a petition to Congress to end wildlife trade. In the process of gathering these signatures, our goal is to build a groundswell of support for the issue, educate people about the issue, and then we'll take that people power to Congress. It's really important about this first step around the signature gathering, because a lot of people don't understand what happens around wildlife trade and how it's related to the current pandemic. So this is our first opportunity. In addition to that, we are going to ask you to help us kick off this campaign by signing up to host an End Wildlife Trade action call the week of July 19th. This call is going to be an online Zoom meeting where you'll talk to folks in your community, neighbors, friends, colleagues, about the importance of ending wildlife trade and help them get educated on the issue and motivated to get involved. And since we're talking COVID and pandemics, and while all of you are on this call, I do want to take a moment to discuss why these meetings will be online. First is the fact that your public health and being safe is our top priority. And right now, the virus is not under control across this country. As a result, we will not be doing any in-person actions for this campaign. And we will not be recruiting people to do in-person actions. The risk is simply too high right now, so we are erring on the side of caution. Also, some of people have asked us, is there any timeline for this changing? Right now, there's not until the virus is under control, and sadly, we are nowhere near that now. But we are not going to let us stop this or this movement. We know that big, ambitious change is possible when enough people won't accept no as the answer and demand change that they want. Hosting one of these action calls is the first step that you can take to building enough support across the country to end wildlife trade once and for all. And let's be honest, we know many of you might not have ever hosted an online meeting before. So we've created a step-by-step guide with instructions. We will also pair you with one of our staff members to work with one-on-one to help you make your meeting a success. And remember, these calls are simply you sharing your passion for this issue and getting your friends and community members pumped up about ending wildlife trade. Now, we're going to launch and host an action poll. This is your opportunity to see how many of you right now can host a action call to end wildlife trade during the week of July 19th. Public education is key. If enough people know the link between wildlife trade, extinction, and pandemics, Congress will have no choice but to address the root causes of the crisis that we're in. So take your chance right now. You should be seeing a poll. We're really hoping that you say yes to that. This is really going to be a core exercise in one, getting your friends, family, and colleagues to be better educated on this issue, getting them motivated and pumped up about why this issue matters. And more importantly, for those of you who have not done this before, getting more comfortable about using virtual and remote online meetings like Zoom or otherwise, because I think it's a super important skill, especially as we navigate this pandemic. Thanks to all of you who have signed up. I see now that the poll is closed. Now, there is one more way you can support the movement tonight. We are going to share our petition to ask Congress to end wildlife trade, and we're going to launch a second poll. Will you sign a petition asking Congress to end wildlife trade and get 20 friends to do the same? I know all of you have 20 friends at least, if not more, people that you know, neighbors, colleagues. 20 is a great goal. Who is going to sign this petition and get 20 of your friends to sign too? So say yes to that poll. This is how we're going to get to 100,000 signatures and show Congress that we won't take no for an answer. Getting friends to sign the petition is the low-hanging fruit. Once you sign the petition, you'll see share buttons right on the next page. You email it to others and post it to social media. So this is your chance. This is the easiest entry in there. So please say yes to that. And we will follow up with that link after this call ends. And that is our action plan for tonight. We have the petition, we have hosting an action call, and that's really going to launch this campaign forward and get us to a place where, once the top secret information is shared with you, you'll be equally excited, and this campaign is really going to take off, and we're going to end wildlife trade for all. And with that, I will pass it back to my colleague, Diane.
Thanks, Quinn, and thanks to all of you who signed up. There are about 600 of you on the call, so unfortunately we won't get to all of your questions, but I'm going to go into some of them at least, and we'll get to as many as we can. And a quick note, if we don't get to your question, you can either reply to the follow-up email tomorrow, or we really recommend that you join us on Slack. So Slack is our online community where you can find upcoming actions. We have live Q&A sessions with staff, and also one-on-one support from staff and peer mentors. So tomorrow at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, we'll have a live Q&A session with Tanya and I about this campaign specifically in the End Wildlife Trade channel for those of you who are already on. And Griselda will also share the Slack link to join in the chat now. All right, with that, let's get into some questions. Let's see. Where do we need to draw the line on wildlife trade to prevent future pandemics? Is some legal wildlife trade okay? Brett or Tanya?
I'll let Tanya go. Go first.
We're both chomping at the bit here. You know, I think this is to me, this is what drives this whole campaign home. We don't know where the next pandemic is coming from. We don't know which species, we don't know what region of the world, and we don't know how that virus is going to jump from one species to the next and get to a place where it can actually impact people. And so for us, if we really truly want to take a precautionary approach, if we want to make sure we don't end up in this situation again, you know, with everything from people losing their livelihoods, they are lacking essential, you know, needs like their utilities, to our government spending trillions of dollars to try to bail us out. There's one easy thing we can do, and that's just to say no more wildlife trade. And that's the simplest solution. I don't know if you have anything to add, Brett.
No, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, we've thought a lot about this. Some of it's in our plan. You know, we have to obviously support the people that depend on wildlife trade. Some in the United States and many around the world for their livelihoods too. They need to have alternatives. But it's, yeah, the risk and the damage that can be done is so massive, as we're seeing right now, that you just have to wonder if it's worth it. Because at some point, all of those animals that are in the wildlife trade are alive and they're in contact with people and they're spreading disease. So you can't just say, oh, well, you know, some of it's happening halfway around the world. It doesn't matter anymore because you can get on a plane and be halfway around the world tomorrow. So I think, yeah, we think that the best answer is to say that it's not worth it. It's also really inhumane. It does tremendous damage, a lot of it, to the environment and to the species involved. So, you know, I think that is the long-term goal, but it's going to take, obviously, several steps to get there.
Definitely. All right, this question is from Robin. What power do individual states have to enact laws to undertake criminal prosecution as animal parts enter or leave individual state boundaries? Do the states have any power there?
Yeah, so, you know, we have a really interesting framework in the US, right, where we're members of CITES, which regulates trade internationally. We have our Endangered Species Act, which is an awesome, phenomenal law. But if you are dealing with species that aren't covered by the Endangered Species Act, or even if they are, states still have power within their borders to ban possession, solely interstate sales, all of that. And so that is one mechanism that states like, for example, California are looking at bills on how do we address these risks right now. So that is definitely an opportunity, and whether those bills have criminal and civil provisions, which I would definitely recommend, that's really important. But that is certainly something that exists. But also acknowledging, as we've talked about, so crucial that we strengthen our Endangered Species Act and make sure that it gets all of its teeth back that the Trump administration has taken away. And I don't know, Brad, if you wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, yes, most states don't. And part of it's also capacity, which is why we're trying to push for more funding from Congress. Most states, I think, want to do the right thing with the wildlife within their states, but it's very hard with the limited budgets they have. And also there's always this inherent tension with one state, you know, do maybe the right thing and then your neighboring state not really enforcing it, and how you make that all uniform. It's really important that Congress, you know, sets some nationwide standards here, because it's very hard. Obviously, California might want to do the right thing, and Arizona doesn't. I feel like there's lots of lessons right now happening with the pandemic that illustrates the problem when you don't have one solution.
Thanks. Let's see here. This person has seen people online blaming wildlife trade on China. How should this be addressed if they come across this when they're talking to other folks about this issue?
I mean, I can say a couple things. I mean, I think we've seen, a lot of unfortunate scapegoating of China. You know, still, we really don't know yet for sure where this came from. Even the initial market in Wuhan may have been simply a super spreader event. But with Ebola, we saw, you know, it can come from Africa. These things can come from the United States. And every country has a share of the responsibility, again, including ourselves. We are a massive driver of global demand, and we prop up a lot of these bad practices because our demand is so insatiable. So yes, this particular pandemic may have come from China, it may not, but it's really not going to work to simply blame one country. We have to lead by example, and the whole world has to join us in that effort, or it ultimately fails, because then some countries will still do the wrong thing, and then all it takes is one person getting on a plane and starting a pandemic. So, you know, it's unfortunate. It happens in a political year, an election year, but the answers have to be really comprehensive, holistic, and we just can't pretend that we don't share some of the responsibility and burden to fix this.
All right. This may be for Brett or others if you want to weigh in. How effective is a petition going to be in getting attention from members of Congress when they're so busy and it's not possible to meet with them in person at this time?
Yeah, I mean, it's a crazy time for sure. The hope, honestly, is that, and then again, I can only share a little bit, but we're very optimistic. There's going to be a narrow window of time in July and early August where maybe Congress actually does something. There may be one more relief bill that is passed to deal with the pandemic. It was called the HEROES Act in the House. It's going to get changed up once it gets to the Senate, but there's obviously, I think, a fair amount of pressure to see that happen. And if there's a strong effort online and remotely to bring attention to this issue and say, you know what really needs to be in that bill is also addressing the cause of this pandemic, I actually think it could matter and it would get noticed, because if we get enough voices saying it, it'll get on their radar. Our hope and plan is actually to try to do this in a really bipartisan way, and it actually really could work. Now, obviously, it can fall apart, but there's actually a good path forward that may actually be there. But let's just say this: if no one makes a noise, it's far less likely. And the more we can really make this happen, and then we can make our friends in the community join us, I think there's a good chance.
You know, one thing to add to that, I think Brett's totally right. And from an organizing perspective, really want everyone to understand the role of what getting signatures for a petition actually plays in this process, which is it's a chance for you to interact with your friends, with your neighbors, and really connect them to this issue. So there's the deeper question, or the further question about, will Congress listen to this? But getting signatures is as old as community organizing is in itself, which is it's a way of showing people support for a particular issue. And it's a great way of you having conversations with your friends and making the pitches to why they should sign, and hopefully generating interest so that they do the same. So it's not less about, but the balance of also the efficacy of the petition itself to Congress is also reflective of the amount of effort that people put into really passionately sharing why this issue is so important and why it needs to change. So when you have that question about like, should we do petitions? Are they effective? They're as effective as we make them, because those conversations are super important. And they're a great way for you to introduce your friends and colleagues to an issue that I'm pretty sure most people have not done a deep dive on.
That's right. And the thing I would add to this is it's really crucial internationally speaking, right? Like we've seen China take some action on these issues in light of the pandemic. If we can generate this momentum in the US to do the same, that puts pressure on everyone else around the world. So we need to have the EU, Japan, the other big wildlife markets also take action. And then we're really seeing global change. We saw this happen with elephant ivory, right? The Obama administration decided to implement a near ban, got China to do the same, and then we've seen countries all around the globe close their domestic ivory markets. So this is just not something that's focused solely on the US. This is generating global momentum as well. It's really important.
Awesome, thanks. It's so important to stay grounded in that through all of this work. Let's see. Oh, okay. I'm pumped to see so many questions about doing outreach and talking to other people about this issue. So I've seen a lot of posts against bats on social media since the pandemic began. How can I communicate this issue to people who are giving bats a bad reputation? What can I do about that?
Yeah, it's really, really sad. We're seeing this all around the world. And I think one of the crucial messages that we have got to get out to people is that wildlife are not to blame for this pandemic or any past ones or any future ones. The burden is on us as people. It's our fault. So it's our misabuse of wildlife, our misabuse of nature, and that's what leads to these pandemics. I think having important little tidbits about how cool bats are and how important they are is absolutely crucial, right? If you talk to anyone who's a farmer, they will say that their livelihood depends on having healthy bat populations. If you like sitting outside in the summer, you want to have healthy bat populations, right? They control a lot of our insects. They're crucial for ecosystem services. And so I think having some of those talking points about bats and why they're so great and why people should love them is also a really important piece of the puzzle. I know Brett really loves bats though, so I think he probably has something to add here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, again, it's unfortunate. It's like you're scapegoating the wrong thing. People caused this. And we still don't really know for sure where it came from. It probably came from a bat, but you know, this is again the inherent risk of the wildlife trade. We don't really know. It's similar to bat viruses, but that doesn't mean it couldn't have come from another animal because we don't have like a comprehensive survey of all of them. But you know, bats, yeah, they provide huge services to people for free, and especially pest control. And some of them are super cute. And I think, you know, you can look online, bats of North America. There's some amazing, cute bats like the spotted bat, just ridiculous, enormous ears and just incredible color pattern. A lot of the fruit-backed bats, the flying foxes, are pretty cute. So showing people pictures of them. There's obviously a lot of fear of bats, which again is mostly irrational. They're basically harmless. And yeah, the more you can just do to kind of put a face to them and say, they're actually doing us a lot of good. You know, if you don't like mosquitoes, you probably should like bats.
If you like tequila, you need to have bats.
If you like tequila, Mexican, was it the long-tongued bat, the Mexican long-tongued bat and the lesser long-tongued bat? Without them, there'd be no agave pollination and there'd be no tequila.
I think that might be the real answer. Right there, I think we finally settled on the real answer why we need to don't blame them.
All right, let's see. Is the U.S. involvement with wildlife trade mostly in the pet trade, or are there other big ways in which we contribute?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of demand in the US for wildlife, and probably in ways you guys don't even realize it. We're going to have some additional information coming out later this month, but I can give you a preview. You probably don't realize it, but your paintbrushes likely have hair from rodents that were captured all around the world. And rodents are one of the species that's known to harbor a lot of diseases. So there's all sorts of things that people buy that they really don't even realize might be contributing to the wildlife trade. So yes, pets are absolutely a big part of US imports, but we do lots in decor, lots in fashion. And then obviously, you know, there are some of the niche trades, like trade for animals for medicine, for trophies. We do a lot of work on trophy hunting. So there's a lot of different uses for animals. And I think that people really need to stop and take a look at what they're buying and where it comes from, and really starting to be cognizant of when they're contributing to the wildlife trade.
Just to add real quick on that, we also export a lot of wildlife, especially turtles and reptiles and amphibians. And we're also a major transit hub as well. So a lot of it comes through the United States, both legally and illegally, en route to other places. So again, we play a huge role in a lot of aspects, and it's not just pets. It's you know, that 800 million dead individual things are all basically trinkets we're buying in many ways. And that's an enormous amount of wildlife that's being killed for US consumption.
So this is actually along similar lines. You said we want Congress to close all live wildlife markets in the US. Where are they in the US, and why hasn't this person heard of them before? Why haven't a lot of us heard of them before?
Well, they're mostly in cities. You know, there obviously is some larger demand in some Asian markets, but they're mostly in cities. But there are, you know, it's a very unregulated thing, so it's hard to say for sure where all of them are happening. You know, consuming wildlife is cultural, and obviously we are a great melting pot from people all over the world, and some of those habits, you know, come with you, and that then creates the demand to bring those animals to the US to be consumed, which again is this crazily inherently dangerous activity because it's not inspected, it's not veterinary, it's not sanitary. So one of the reasons you don't hear about them is that many of them aren't very, they're kind of, you know, discreet. They're sort of below the radar. They're not advertised. There's not a big store that says that, but they happen in lots of places, and it's hard to get a handle on, which is why we need to have stronger laws, because right now it is legal. There's nothing wrong with it, even though it's really dangerous. So no one knows for sure where they all are yet, because it's just, we've just looked the other way for too long.
Yeah, and I think it's really important too to recognize that this call in the US to close live wildlife markets is, again, important for its international ramifications. This is an issue that we are really hopeful governments around the globe are going to grapple with and address this problem as best they can for giving their population and their population's needs, right? So we sit here in the US, we're going to deal with US demand. We work with NGOs that work in countries around the world. They can deal with, in their own countries, the best way to respond on this. But again, we need this pressure from the US, just like we had pressure from China to address this situation for our market and to do everything we can to reduce this risk.
Definitely. All right, let's see. Okay, so wouldn't a ban on wildlife trade just drive the market underground?
Yeah, we get asked that question a lot. And I think that the answer here has to be no, in part because of the global momentum that we're creating with this effort, right? If you see China taking action and throwing up barriers to wildlife trade, if the US is doing the same, if you see that from other consumer countries, hopefully the EU, the UK, maybe even Japan, these are the countries that not only are main consumers of wildlife products, but they also hold a lot of the wealth, and they have a lot of the capability in terms of enforcement. So not only can we do a lot on our end in terms of drying out the supply channels, enforcement, making sure that we're stopping trade, both in the black market and the legal trade, but also we can pour the resources into what's needed to shift livelihoods away from wildlife trade so that we don't have people who are driven underground and still dependent on the black market for income.
I'll just add, I mean, you could make that argument for literally any law, right? I mean, all laws have compliance and enforcement challenges. One of the reasons we're also calling for money is because, yeah, some of it will, but you know, most of it won't, because most people are generally law abiding, and if you help them transition, they will switch to a different option. Some will go underground, but we have to do enforcement anyway, and we have to crack down on existing illegal wildlife trade. So it's not really a good excuse to like not take action, right? Because you can always say that about murder. I mean, you know, it's like there are things that we prohibit. Yes, they still happen, but that's why we need to also have, again, this big holistic approach to this issue.
All right, I think there's just, we don't have much time left, but there is a follow-up question, I think, for you, Tanya. A few folks are asking how they can tell if products that they're using have been crafted from wildlife.
Yes, I think it's really important to look for the list of ingredients to try to get a sense of what it is. So if, for example, when you're looking at paint brushes and fly fishing flies, there's a lot, if they say that they're made out of natural fibers, they probably have rodent hair on them. We're gonna have, like I said, some more information coming out later this month with a lot of details on the US market and what we're consuming. And that I think is going to be really helpful. But I think another thing I would just flag is, you know, I've seen a lot of interest in skulls and bones and things like that. And just making sure that when you're getting those, that they were collected from animals that died of natural causes in your own country, and that they're not something that's being imported from another country, and you're not fueling demand for a primate skull for your office. Likewise with bats, I mean, yeah, some people are scared of them, but a lot of people revere them, and they are heavily in demand in paperweights and for all sorts of artwork. And so just double checking yourself, do I really need to have this for my home? I think that's really important. And asking those questions, you know, going to wherever you're looking online and saying, hey, where did this come from? What are its origins? What is it made out of? And making retailers display that information. That's all really crucially important, and that'll get you a lot of information, because we need to start asking those questions and making sure that other people get aware of what it is that they're buying.
Thanks, Tanya. All right, I'm going to squeeze in one more question because I may be biased, but I think this is the most important question that we've gotten. What can I do to help this cause as an individual besides donating money? First of all, thanks so much for donating, but second, organize with us, join the campaign. You can go to endwildlifetrade.org and get all the resources, sign the petition and all of that. But yeah, getting involved and spreading this message, building this groundswell of support so that Congress will take real action. That's how we're going to end this. All right. Did anyone else have anything to add on that before I pass it over to Quentin?
I'll just echo that. I think that's totally right. I mean, I get emails from folks, including our own activists, telling us how they helped, you know, get people to co-sponsor on FinAct. I mean, it doesn't take that much sometimes to change the positions of a member of Congress, because you show that you care, and they don't know what people care about unless you tell them. So it's really important.
Totally, thanks. All right, so if we didn't get to your questions, and I know there are a bunch we didn't get to, definitely join us on Slack. The link is in the chat box, and join us tomorrow at 12 Pacific or 3 p.m. Eastern. Tanya and I will be on to answer your questions live. We've had this question a bunch, so if you can't make that time, you can go back and see the responses, but not ask live questions. So just know they're in there, but it's better if you can join us live and ask your question. All right, with that, I'll pass it over to Quentin to close us out.
Great, thanks, Diane. I think that Brett really put his finger on something, and I didn't realize it until he said it, which is members of Congress don't know anything until you until you let them know that they should know something. And really, that's actually while it's somewhat funny, it's also very true. And they are, inundated with a variety of things all of the time, and they have staff and they whatever, but we have to make them hear us. And at the same point, that also applies to all of your friends, family members, and otherwise. They're not going to know and probably don't know about the details that we shared with you tonight about wildlife trade unless you tell them. And so, the first thing, as we talked about, is to sign and share the petition. Griselda right now is putting it in the chat box again. And that petition is your first vehicle towards connecting with people around wildlife trade. It starts conversations, it starts your organizing, it starts this campaign. So that is the first step. After that, everybody check your inboxes tomorrow, because you will be getting an email with specific next steps for setting up an action meeting, and as well as the recording of this call. So if you want to go over and listen to some of the responses that Tanya or Brett or Diane or myself sort of gave, you'll be able to do that. But make sure that you check your inbox tomorrow. That email is going to give you specific next steps about how not only to share the petition, but also around hosting a meeting and also the recording. Also want to make sure, give a little pitch. You can go to endwildlifetrade.org. Griselda's going to share that in the chat, endwildlifetrade.org. And that is the one-stop shop for you to get the resources around this campaign and get you the information that you need to take action. Please, on a last note, I want to make sure that you add Mobilize at biologicaldiversity.org to your email contacts to make sure this does not go into your spam and you get these emails. So those are your specific steps: petition, action, check your email, set up a meeting, get your friends and family involved. Yeah, and I just want to thank everybody. Thank all of our my colleagues, Brett, Tanya, Diane, for their presentations tonight. It's a super important issue. We are in the midst of a deeply disturbing, super challenging time right now with the global pandemic. It's going to take all of us to really turn the tide for this, and that is not only from a public health perspective, but from an extinction crisis perspective. And, if you ask Diane and I, from an organizing perspective. So we're going to certainly turn this into an opportunity to get the change that this country deserves and that we need to keep us all safe. So I just want to say thank you so much. We really look forward to working with you in the coming weeks and months. Stay tuned for the top secret update that's going to come out soon that you're going to be very happy about, and that really we are looking forward to, because it's going to really jumpstart our organizing and really put some teeth to all this. So super excited for this. I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. We had a great turnout. And yeah, thanks so much. We look forward to working with you.